Reba McEntire finally breaks her silence on Vince Gill. And the truth is not what decades of whispers prepared anyone to hear. For more than 30 years, one question followed her through interviews, award shows, and quiet backstage moments. A duet that felt too real. A connection that vanished without explanation. And a silence so complete that it became louder than any answer she could have given. Fans replayed the song, studied the glances, and waited for a confession that never came. Reba never corrected the rumors. She never closed the door publicly. She simply let time hold the story, even as curiosity hardened into belief. In a world that demands access, her refusal to explain felt deliberate, almost defiant. But now at 70, Reba McEntire has finally chosen to speak, not to ignite drama, but to settle it. And the question is, when the silence finally gave way, what did she reveal about Vince Gill that changed the meaning of everything that came before? Before the silence ever became part of Reba McEntire's story, there was trust built far from stages and spotlights. She was born on March 28, 1955, in McAlester, Oklahoma, a place where resilience was learned early and comfort rarely came easy. Life on a ranch did not reward shortcuts, it rewarded endurance. That environment shaped her long before music ever did. Her father, Clark McEntire, was a world champion steer roper, a man whose discipline came from repetition and resolve rather than applause. Her mother, Jacqueline McEntire, balanced that toughness with encouragement, teaching school by day and nurturing music at home. Together, they created a foundation where effort mattered more than outcome and consistency mattered more than recognition. Reba grew up watching hard work unfold quietly, day after day, without guarantees. Music was present, but it was not treated as escape, it was treated as craft. She learned early that talent alone did not carry a person forward. Commitment did. That lesson followed her when she began pursuing a career that moved slower than she expected. Her early years in the industry were marked by persistence rather than reward. Records came and went without impact. Tours passed without transformation. Success did not arrive on demand. That slow growth hardened her in necessary ways. It taught patience. It taught restraint. It taught her how to survive disappointment without letting it erode belief. By the time her breakthrough arrived in the 1980s, it came not as surprise but as earned ground. Songs finally connected. Audiences responded. Recognition followed. Yet even then she remained careful. Fame did not erase the habits formed during struggle. As the 1990s approached, Reba entered a new chapter carrying both momentum and vulnerability. She was successful, but not untouched. The demands of a growing career required constant adjustment. The weight of expectation increased. Behind the scenes, she was still the same woman shaped by responsibility and reflection, steady but carrying the cost of endurance. This period mattered, because survival had already taught her discernment. She understood how quickly circumstances could change. She valued people who showed up without demanding space. Trust had become selective, shaped by experience rather than optimism. She did not mistake attention for loyalty or success for safety. The emotional state she carried into this decade was layered. Confidence existed alongside caution. Achievement lived beside memory. She knew what it meant to build something slowly and protect it carefully. That awareness influenced how she moved, how she listened, and who she allowed near her creative center. In this context, connection took on a different meaning. It was not about advancement, it was about steadiness, about finding alignment during moments when survival still required strength, even in success. Trust formed not through ambition, but through presence. Reba's story, before the silence, was never one of ease. It was one of preparation. The years of slow progress, the grounding of her upbringing, and the discipline modeled by her parents all shaped how she navigated change. By the time her path crossed with new collaborators, she was no longer searching for validation. She was protecting balance. That protection would later be misunderstood as distance. Yet it began here, rooted in a life where survival preceded celebration. The space she carried into the 1990s was not empty, it was carefully held. Some moments are never meant to repeat because their power lives in their singularity. The Heart Won't Lie was one of those moments. It arrived not as part of a long plan, but as a precise convergence of timing, emotion, and readiness that could not be recreated on demand. The song was recorded in late 1992, during a period when Reba McEntire's career carried both strength and vulnerability. She was established, respected, and visible, yet still navigating the emotional weight of recent years. The studio did not feel like a launch pad. It felt like a place of focus. Into that space stepped Vince Gill, a vocalist known for restraint, clarity, and emotional control. Their pairing did not rely on spectacle. It relied on balance. When The Heart Won't Lie was released, its impact was immediate. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart and stayed there for 2 consecutive weeks. The song remained on the chart for a total of 20 weeks, a testament to its resonance rather than hype. Audiences did not just hear it once. They returned to it repeatedly, finding something familiar yet unresolved inside its melody. Recognition followed. The duet was nominated for the Country Music Association's Vocal Event of the Year, solidifying its place within the industry's formal memory. Yet awards did not fully explain its endurance. The song's appeal came from its emotional credibility. Nothing about it felt forced. The phrasing lingered. The pauses mattered. The restraint created space for listeners to insert their own meaning. The music video amplified that effect. Reba appeared as a military cadet. Vince played her love interest. The storyline leaned into separation, duty, and longing without excess. The visuals mirrored the song's emotional core, connection held in tension rather than release. Viewers responded not to drama, but to authenticity. The story felt lived rather than performed. That combination made the duet difficult to forget. It did not feel like a collaboration designed for repetition. It felt complete. Attempting to follow it with another version would have diminished what made it effective. The song existed as a closed circle, emotionally finished the moment it was delivered. This is where expectation began to form. In an industry accustomed to momentum, audiences assumed continuation. Another duet, a tour, a sequel. When none arrived, attention shifted. Silence replaced speculation's opposite. The absence of repetition turned the song into a question mark rather than a period. But within the architecture of Reba's career, the choice not to repeat made sense. Not every successful moment requires extension. Some are meant to stand alone, protected by their finality. The Heart Won't Lie did not need reinforcement. Its staying power came from the fact that it was never diluted. For Vince Gill, the moment aligned with his own trajectory, one defined by selective collaborations and emotional precision. For Reba, it represented a convergence rather than a pivot. Their voices met where they needed to meet, and then moved forward separately without rupture. The song's refusal to fade created its own legacy. It lived on radio, in memory, and in conversation. The fact that it was never repeated allowed it to remain untouched by comparison. Its strength stayed intact. What made The Heart Won't Lie endure was not mystery, but containment. It was allowed to be exactly what it was, and nothing more. When the music stopped, the silence did not. Over time, it became the story people focused on most. The Heart Won't Lie continued to echo through radios and memory, yet no explanation ever followed it. There was no announcement, no statement, no carefully framed answer to satisfy curiosity. What remained was absence, and absence has a way of drawing attention. In Nashville, silence rarely stays neutral. Award shows came and went. Reba McEntire and Vince Gill appeared in the same rooms, applauded each other's achievements, and maintained visible respect. There were no tense moments caught on camera, no cold shoulders, no public discomfort, nothing that resembled conflict. No confirmed feud or fallout was ever reported, and no one involved suggested otherwise. Still, questions followed. Media outlets noticed the lack of continuation. Fans remembered the chemistry. Commentators filled space with theory because space was available. When artists collaborate successfully, the expectation is extension. When that extension never arrives, people look for reasons. Silence becomes material. Reba never offered one. She did not explain why there were no additional duets. She did not correct assumptions. She did not revisit the moment publicly, even as the song remained part of her legacy. Over the years, that restraint hardened into narrative. The less she said, the more meaning others assigned to it. Decades passed without clarification. Interviews circled the topic and moved on. Red carpets produced polite smiles and professional distance. Public appearances confirmed mutual respect but offered no insight. The absence of comment began to feel intentional, not evasive. Silence settled in as a boundary rather than a gap. This is how myth forms, not through evidence, but through endurance. When time passes without explanation, curiosity deepens instead of fading. Reba's refusal to explain did not close the story, it preserved it. Every year that passed without another duet reinforced the sense that something had been deliberately left untouched. The industry noticed, but could not penetrate it. Nashville thrives on stories, yet this one resisted packaging. There was nothing to quote, nothing to dispute, nothing to headline. The lack of drama made it harder to resolve. Silence offered no angles. Importantly, that silence never turned hostile. Reba continued her career without disruption. Vince Gill did the same. Their paths diverged naturally, without overlap or comment. The absence of collaboration was never framed as rejection. It simply existed. That consistency mattered. Over time, silence shifted from suspicion to signature. Reba became known not only for what she delivered on stage, but for what she withheld off it. In a culture that often rewards exposure, her restraint stood out. It suggested intention rather than avoidance. What people often misunderstood was the discipline required to maintain that boundary. Saying nothing for a season is easy. Saying nothing for decades is deliberate. It requires clarity about what does not belong to public consumption. As years turned into generations, the silence accumulated meaning. Not because it hid something explosive, but because it protected something finite. The absence of additional duets was no longer a question of what went wrong. It became a question of what was being preserved. By the time Reba McEntire turned 70 in 2025, something in her public presence had shifted, not in volume, but in weight. The urgency that once surrounded unanswered questions no longer followed her. What remained was clarity, carried without effort. Time had done what explanation never could. At 70, Reba was no longer navigating legacy. She was living inside it. That year she hosted the 60th Academy of Country Music Awards, standing comfortably in a role that reflected decades of contribution rather than relevance chasing. The moment did not feel like a milestone. It felt earned. There was ease in how she spoke, how she moved, how she acknowledged her history without revisiting it unnecessarily. Her life remained full. Acting continued to be part of her work. Music remained present, not as obligation, but as expression. Mentoring younger artists had become second nature, a continuation of values formed long before fame arrived. She recorded, appeared, and advised without urgency. Nothing about her schedule suggested retreat. Everything suggested intention. It was from that place that she finally addressed the question she had carried quietly for so long. When she spoke, it did not sound like revelation. It sounded like release. There was no attempt to correct the past aggressively, no desire to reshape public memory. The truth was offered simply, without ornament. What she clarified was careful and contained. There was no romance confirmed, No scandal revealed, no dramatic recontextualization of events. What existed between her and Vince Gill was described as professional, respectful, and shaped by circumstance. A moment formed by timing, emotional weight, and shared discipline. Nothing more. Nothing hidden. Grief mattered in that framing. Timing mattered. The early 1990s were not neutral years in her life. They carried loss and adjustment that influenced how she moved forward. In that space, collaboration was not casual. It was deliberate. And once the moment passed, it did not demand repetition. Reba's tone mattered as much as her words. There was no defensiveness, no explanation offered to satisfy speculation. She did not speak as someone correcting a misunderstanding. She spoke as someone acknowledging a chapter that no longer required protection. That distinction changed everything. The truth did not arrive burdened. It arrived light because it had waited long enough to be free of consequence. At 70, Reba no longer needed approval for how she handled her past. She did not owe the story urgency. She owed it accuracy. What had once felt heavy now felt settled. The silence that carried so much meaning no longer needed to hold it alone. When she spoke, the words landed gently because they were no longer trying to compete with rumor. They were simply placed where they belonged. The years had softened the edges without dulling the truth. Time removed the pressure to perform explanation. What remained was honesty without defense. The absence of drama was not anticlimactic, it was appropriate. This was not a confession. It was a clarification offered at the right moment by someone no longer defined by reaction. The truth did not change the past. It reframed it. By the time Reba McEntire chose to speak, the silence no longer needed defending. It simply needed understanding. What many had treated as mystery was never designed to be one. It became that way only because people expected continuation where none was promised. Reba described Vince Gill with clarity rather than correction. Respectful, supportive, present when it mattered. Her words carried no urgency, no emotional charge meant to redirect attention. They carried recognition. What existed between them was not framed as unfinished business, but as a moment that fulfilled its purpose. Nothing more was required. She stated plainly that there was no planned ending, no decision to stop, no conversation that closed a door. Life simply moved on. Careers expanded. Directions shifted. The absence of another duet was not the result of rupture, but of momentum pulling two artists toward different chapters at the same time. That explanation challenged the assumption that significance must lead somewhere. In popular memory, meaningful collaborations are expected to multiply. Success becomes obligation. Yet not every alignment is meant to repeat. Some moments exist precisely because they are limited. The Heart Won't Lie did not fail to continue. It completed itself. The pairing was never built to become a partnership. It was a meeting point, not a merging of paths. When the moment passed, it did so without friction. That quiet conclusion preserved its integrity. What listeners often misunderstood was the nature of artistic alignment. Chemistry does not always imply longevity. Two voices can meet perfectly once without needing to meet again. Reba's silence allowed the song to remain intact, unburdened by follow-up expectations or diluted by repetition. The public filled the space because the space existed. Meaning was mistaken for mystery. Emotional clarity was interpreted as withheld truth. Yet what Reba offered later reframed everything. The silence was not avoidance. It was containment. She did not need to dismantle the myths individually. By stating that life simply moved on, she removed the foundation they stood on. There was no hidden chapter to uncover, no secret ending to reveal. The story was complete, even if it did not announce itself. This reframing shifted the focus from what did not happen to what did. A single collaboration that resonated deeply. Mutual respect that endured without display. A moment allowed to stand on its own merits. That is where the meaning lived. Closure arrived not through explanation, but through perspective. Reba's words did not add drama. They removed it. The truth did not diminish the song's power. It clarified it. Knowing that nothing broke made the moment stronger, not smaller. What people often seek is continuation, because continuation feels reassuring. Endings without ceremony feel unfinished. Yet some stories conclude the instant they deliver what they were meant to give. Their quiet ending is not a flaw. It is the point. Reba's silence, once misunderstood, revealed itself as stewardship. She protected the moment by not forcing it into something else. By the time she spoke, nothing needed defending. Reba McEntire did not expose scandal. She clarified history. What had been carried for decades as mystery was never built on secrecy. It was built on timing, trust, and the quiet discipline to let a moment remain what it was. Vince Gill was part of her story, not as an unresolved chapter, but as a defined one. Their connection formed during a season shaped by grief and adjustment, when collaboration required steadiness rather than spectacle. The music reflected that truth, and when the moment passed, it did so without fracture. Nothing was taken away. Nothing was hidden. Silence in this case preserved dignity rather than confusion. By refusing to dramatize what did not need expansion, Reba allowed the work to speak without distortion. The song stayed intact because it was never forced to explain itself. Over time, the absence of commentary became misread as mystery, when it was simply restraint. At 70, Reba did not rewrite the past. She placed it gently where it belonged. The truth did not need volume, it needed timing. And when it finally arrived, it settled rather than disrupted. For more emotional stories, check out this video.